Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in U.S. history. Today, we will delve into the events that shook a small community in Massachusetts in 1922, when two sisters vanished without a trace, and what was later discovered forever altered how that region viewed its own neighbors. Massachusetts in the early 20s was a land of contrasts. While Boston buzzed with the energy of the Jazz Age, and echoes of the First World War still resonated in veterans' conversations, the small towns of the interior maintained their own rhythm, almost untouched by time. It was an era when families had known each other for generations, when doors were seldom locked, and a person's word was worth more than any signed contract. But this apparent tranquility concealed secrets no one could have imagined. The Blackwood sisters, Eleanor and Margaret, were 23 and 21 years old, respectively. Daughters of a respected Hampshire merchant, they were known for their understated beauty and impeccable manners, inherited from their mother, who had passed away years earlier from a fever that swept through the region. Eleanor, the eldest, had brown hair, always tied up in an elegant bun, and eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. Margaret was different, more exuberant, with laughter that echoed through the wooden house where they lived with their father and younger brother Thomas, then only 16. The Blackwood family lived on an estate near Northampton, a university town that breathed knowledge and tradition. The house stood on a dirt road, surrounded by dense forests of oak and birch, where the silence of nature was broken only by birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was a beautiful place by day, but it took on unsettling contours when night fell and shadows stretched among the trees. It all began on an October afternoon when the leaves were already staining the ground with shades of orange and red. Eleanor and Margaret had set out to walk to the estate of a family friend, about 2 miles away. The route was familiar, a trail they had walked since childhood, skirting abandoned crop fields and crossing a small forest before reaching the main road. They were supposed to return before nightfall, as they always did. But when the sky began to darken and the two did not appear, Mr. Blackwood felt a tightness in his chest he could not explain. Thomas was the first to search for his sisters. Carrying an oil lantern and accompanied by 2 neighbors, he walked the entire trail, shouting the names of Eleanor and Margaret. The forest returned only the echo of their own voices. There was no sign of the girls, no torn piece of cloth, no lost items, absolutely nothing to indicate where they had been or what might have happened. It was as if the earth had swallowed them. In the early hours of the next morning, practically the entire community was mobilized. Farmers left their crops, merchants closed their shops, and even local parish priests joined the search. Groups formed and scoured every inch of the region, entering parts of the forest where few ventured, exploring abandoned barns and checking old wells. The county sheriff, a man named William Porter, with nearly 30 years of experience, personally took charge of coordinating the investigation. The friend the Blackwood sisters intended to visit, Sarah Hutchinson, was questioned repeatedly. She swore that Eleanor and Margaret never arrived at her house that afternoon. Sarah was certain of this because she had spent the entire day sewing near the living room window, which offered a clear view of the access road. Had the sisters approached, she would have seen them. This information only deepened the mystery. Where exactly had the two disappeared? Newspapers in Northampton and surrounding towns began covering the case with increasing intensity. Headlines like, "Sisters Vanish in Broad Daylight," "Dark Mystery Haunts Hampshire County," graced the front pages. Speculation arose in droves. Some said the girls had run away to start a new life in a big city, a theory their father vehemently rejected, knowing his daughter's character and family ties. Others spoke of wild animals, although there had been no reports of attacks in the region for decades. And then there were those who whispered about something more sinister, about presences inhabiting the oldest parts of the forest. What no one yet knew was that this disappearance was just the beginning of a sequence of discoveries that would reveal a truth far more disturbing than any initial theory could have predicted. As days turned into weeks, the temperature in Massachusetts began to drop dramatically. Autumn gave way to an early winter, and the first snowfalls covered the region with a white blanket, making the search even more difficult. Trails disappeared under the snow, and any evidence that might have been left behind was now buried under layers of ice. Mr. Blackwood had aged years in a matter of weeks. His gray hair seemed whiter by the day, and his eyes held a deep sadness that no words could describe. Sheriff Porter did not give up. He was a meticulous man, known for his stubbornness in solving cases others considered lost. He began reviewing every detail, every conversation, every tiny bit of information he had gathered. It was then that something in the testimonies caught his attention. 3 different people at different times mentioned seeing an unfamiliar man in the vicinity of the Blackwood estate in the days before the sisters' disappearance. The descriptions were vague, almost nebulous, but there was one common point. It was someone who did not belong to that community. One farmer, Joshua Miller, was more specific. He said he had seen a tall fellow wearing a dark trench coat and a hat that hid much of his face, walking along the road leading to the Blackwood estate. What intrigued Miller most was that the man did not return his greeting, simply continuing to walk as if in a trance. This happened 2 days before the disappearance. Porter noted every word, feeling he finally had something concrete to investigate. Authorities began looking for outsiders who might have passed through the area on those days. They checked arrival and departure records in the surrounding towns, spoke to stagecoach drivers and railway station employees. Massachusetts was connected by an extensive train network that brought in and took people from all parts of the country, making tracking every traveler nearly impossible. But Porter was not a man to give up easily. He expanded the investigation beyond the county, sending telegrams to police stations in other regions describing the mysterious man and inquiring about similar cases. Meanwhile, life in Northampton had changed. Families began locking their doors religiously, something previously considered unnecessary. Parents accompanied their children to and from school in person. Young women avoided going out alone, especially at dusk. Fear had settled over that community like an invisible fog, altering behaviors and creating an atmosphere of distrust. Neighbors looked at each other suspiciously, wondering if someone they had known for years might be hiding something terrible. In mid-November, a reply to Porter's telegram made his blood run cold. The sheriff of a small county in western Massachusetts, near the New York state border, reported a disturbingly similar case from 3 years earlier. 2 young sisters had disappeared while walking between rural properties. They were never found, and the case remained unsolved. The sheriff also mentioned that at the time, there were reports of a stranger dressed in dark clothing wandering the area days before the disappearance. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Porter felt he was facing something much larger than he had initially imagined. If there was a connection between the cases, it meant this wasn't an isolated incident, but possibly a pattern. He began to question whether other young women had disappeared under similar circumstances throughout the state. Cases that were never linked due to a lack of communication between different jurisdictions. Back then, before modern recording and communication systems, it was entirely possible for connected crimes to go unnoticed as isolated events. Winter was advancing relentlessly, and with it came Christmas. For most Northampton families, it should have been a time of celebration and togetherness. But for the Blackwoods, it was just another painful reminder of Eleanor and Margaret's absence. Thomas tried to stay strong for his father, but at night in his room, he wept silently for the loss of his sisters. He refused to believe they were dead, clinging to the hope that they were still alive somewhere, waiting to return. It was during that harsh winter that Porter made a bold decision. He would personally travel to the county where the previous case occurred, talk to witnesses, and examine all available records. Perhaps there was something the local sheriff had missed, some detail that could shed light on the Blackwood sisters' case. The journey would be long and dangerous due to weather conditions, but Porter was determined. He carried with him a feeling he rarely experienced in his years of work, the feeling of hunting something truly evil. Before leaving, Porter visited the Blackwood family. He sat with Mr. Blackwood in the room where so many happy memories had been made, and where now only the shadow of tragedy loomed. He promised he would not rest until he found out what happened to Eleanor and Margaret. The old merchant gripped the sheriff's hand tightly, and in his eyes was a mix of gratitude and despair that Porter would never forget. Porter's journey through the Massachusetts winter was about to reveal dark connections stretching back years, pointing to a truth far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Porter's trip to Berkshire County in far western Massachusetts took nearly 3 full days. The roads were covered in snow and ice, making every mile a battle against the elements. He traveled by train as far as possible, then hired a carriage that took him along back roads through tiny villages where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. The Berkshire Mountains rose on the horizon like sleeping giants, their slopes covered with forest so dense that sunlight could scarcely penetrate the trees, even on the clearest days. The sheriff of Berkshire County was a man named Herbert Dawson, nearly 50 years old, with a solid reputation among his peers. When Porter finally arrived at the small police station on a frigid January afternoon in 1923, Dawson greeted him with a firm handshake and an expression mixing curiosity and what seemed like relief. It was rare to receive a visit from another officer willing to revisit an old case, especially one that had left so many questions unanswered. Dawson led Porter to a room at the back of the station, where piles of documents and dusty files occupied wooden shelves creaking under the weight of the years. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table between them. Inside were all the records concerning the disappearance of sisters Catherine and Anne Morrison, which had occurred in September 1919. The similarities to the Blackwood case were disturbing. 2 young sisters vanished while walking between rural properties in broad daylight. No trace found, no plausible explanation. But there was something else, something Dawson had not mentioned in the telegram. He hesitated a moment before revealing it, as if the words were hard to say. 3 weeks after the Morrison sisters disappeared, a farmer hunting rabbits in the woods north of the county found something buried shallowly under leaves and branches. It was a scarf embroidered with Catherine Morrison's initials, stained and torn, hidden in a remote area where few ventured. The discovery reignited the search, but even with dozens of men scouring the area for days, nothing more was found. The Morrison sisters remained missing. Porter felt a shiver run down his spine. He asked to see the scarf, and Dawson brought it out, neatly wrapped in butcher paper. Even after years, the dark stains on the delicate fabric were visible. Porter examined every inch of the object, looking for any overlooked detail. The embroidery was fine, clearly done by skilled hands, and the initials were adorned with small blue flowers. It was the kind of work that required hours of dedication, probably a family gift, or something Catherine had made herself. The 2 sheriffs spent hours reviewing the witness testimonies in the Morrison case. As in the Blackwood case, there were mentions of a strange man seen in the area days before the disappearance. A street vendor who passed through regularly said he encountered a tall fellow in dark clothes walking alone on a back road. The vendor particularly remembered the man's eyes, which seemed empty, expressionless, as if he were looking through things rather than at them. When the vendor tried to strike up a conversation, as he usually did with everyone he met, the stranger simply turned his face away and kept walking. Porter and Dawson began comparing the descriptions of the mystery man in the 2 cases. Although vague, There were consistencies impossible to ignore. Above-average height, dark overcoat, hat hiding his face, evasive behavior. But there was a problem. 3 years had passed between the cases. Could it be the same person? And if so, where was he now? The possibility that he could be planning or had already committed another crime weighed on both of them like a stone. Dawson then revealed something that had haunted him since the Morrison case. Weeks after the sisters' disappearance, he began receiving anonymous letters. There weren't many, maybe 5 or 6 over the following months, but they all had the same kind of disturbing content, enigmatic phrases about the forest, silence, and buried secrets. Nothing that could be used as concrete evidence, but enough to make Dawson lose sleep for many nights. The letters stopped arriving after a few months, and he eventually filed them away as the work of some idler, seeking attention or causing fear. Porter asked to see the letters, and Dawson retrieved them from a locked filing cabinet. They were written in neat cursive, with black ink on plain paper, available at any store. There were no usable fingerprints, of course, as such technology was still primitive and rarely available outside major cities then. Porter read each letter slowly, trying to find patterns in the language, the word choice, anything that might reveal something about the writer. One phrase in particular caught his eye. The forests of Massachusetts hold more secrets than you can imagine, and some secrets prefer to remain buried where the roots are deep. There was something about the way it was written, an almost poetic familiarity with the landscape, suggesting the author knew the region well. This was not just someone passing through, but possibly someone who had lived there, who knew the forests, the roads, the places people rarely went. That night, Porter stayed at a small boarding house in the town center. He could barely sleep, his mind working incessantly to connect the dots. 2 cases, separated by 3 years and several kilometers, yet with undeniable similarities. A mysterious man who seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as inexplicably. Enigmatic letters that suggested knowledge of the crimes, and above all, young women who simply ceased to exist as if torn from reality itself. When the sun rose over the Berkshire Mountains, painting the sky in pink and orange hues, Porter was already awake and dressed. He had made a resolute decision during his sleepless night. Before returning to Northampton, he needed to visit the spot where Catherine Morrison's scarf had been found. Perhaps something remained there, some clue the years had not completely erased. Dawson agreed to accompany him, and shortly after breakfast, they set off, riding through the snow towards the county's northern forests. What they would find in that ancient forest would completely alter the investigation's course and reveal that the horror was even greater than anyone could have imagined. The ride into the forest took almost 2 hours. The cold was biting, and the wind sweeping down from the Berkshire Mountains carried tiny ice crystals that stung their faces like needles. Dawson knew the way well, having traveled that route dozens of times during the original searches for the Morrison sisters. They followed a main road until they reached a turnoff marked only by an ancient tree with a trunk split by lightning, then entered a narrow path winding through pines and firs. The forest here was unlike any Porter had ever seen. The trees grew so close together, they formed a kind of natural roof, blocking almost all sunlight. Even at noon, the feeling was one of perpetual twilight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the muffled sound of horses' hooves in the snow and the occasional rustle of some small animal in the undergrowth. Porter felt a growing discomfort as they advanced, as if the forest itself was watching them. Dawson finally stopped near a small, barely noticeable clearing among the trees. He dismounted and pointed to a specific spot where the ground looked slightly different from the rest, even beneath the snow. It was there that the farmer had found Catherine Morrison's scarf, shallowly buried under a layer of leaves that seemed to have been deliberately arranged to hide something. Porter also dismounted and began scanning the surrounding area, looking for anything that might have gone unnoticed years before. The sheriff began walking in ever-widening circles from the central point, his trained eyes scrutinizing every irregularity in the terrain. Dawson watched him in silence, respecting his colleague's investigative method. It was when Porter was about 20 meters from the original point that he noticed something strange. Several trees had markings on their trunks, carvings that looked old, but were clearly made by a human hand. They weren't recognizable symbols, just deep scratches in the bark, as if someone had used a sharp knife to mark a path. Porter called Dawson over and showed him the markings. The local sheriff frowned, confused. Those marks hadn't been there during the original searches, or at least no one had noticed them. They decided to follow the marked trees, which seemed to form an irregular path deeper into the forest. Every 50 or 60 yards, another marked tree appeared, always maintaining a general northerly direction. It was as if someone had created a secret map, visible only to those who knew how to look. After walking for almost half an hour following the markings, leading their horses by the reins due to the dense vegetation, they reached an area where the forest opened up slightly. Here, hidden among moss-covered rocks and protected by dense shrubs, was a primitive hut. The structure was old, probably built decades earlier by some hunter or lumberjack, and was in a state of advanced decay. Part of the roof had collapsed, and the wooden walls were rotting in several places. The two men exchanged a tense look before cautiously approaching the cabin. Porter drew his revolver, a precaution that seemed necessary given the strangeness. Dawson did the same. They moved slowly, their steps cautious in the snow, alert to any movement or sound. When they finally reached the cabin's entrance, a dark opening that looked more like the mouth of a cave, Porter felt his heart race. The interior was in complete darkness. Dawson had brought a flashlight, and when he turned it on, the dim light revealed a small, claustrophobic space. The floor was covered with dry leaves, twigs, and debris accumulated over the years. There were remnants of an ancient fire in one corner, blackened stones arranged in a circle. And then, when Dawson moved the flashlight to better illuminate the space, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Hanging from rusty nails on the wall were pieces of fabric, scraps of dresses, scarves, hair ribbons, all clearly feminine, and from different eras. Some were faded and practically falling apart. Others looked more recent. Porter slowly approached, his breath forming clouds of steam in the icy air. He examined the fabrics without touching them, noting the different colors and patterns. There were at least 15 or 20 pieces there, each probably belonging to a different woman. Dawson was pale. His voice trembled when he finally spoke, saying this wasn't possible, that during the original searches that area had been checked. But Porter knew that in such a dense forest, with uneven terrain and limited visibility, it would be perfectly possible to pass within a few feet of that cabin without noticing it, especially if one knew the area well and had deliberately chosen that location for its ability to remain hidden. Continuing the search inside the cabin, Porter found more disturbing objects. There was a small wooden chest partially buried under the floor debris. When he pulled it out and opened the rusty lid, he found inside a macabre collection of personal belongings: hair combs, small mirrors, brooches, even some letters yellowed with time. Each object told the story of a life, of a person who had been someone, who had a family, dreams, a future. And all these stories had ended there, in that forgotten forest. Among the objects, Porter found something that confirmed his worst suspicions: a small diary with a leather cover, its pages stained and difficult to read. He opened it carefully and began to examine the entries. The handwriting was the same as in the anonymous letters Dawson had received. The pages contained fragmentary thoughts, observations about women the author had seen, descriptions of routes and schedules, It was the record of someone who planned meticulously, who studied his victims before acting. One entry in particular caught Porter's eye. It was dated August 1919, just 1 month before the Morrison sisters disappeared. The writing described 2 young women who regularly walked along a specific road, always at the same time in the afternoon. The author described their hair, their clothes, even the sound of their laughter echoing across the field. It was evident that he had observed them for days, or perhaps weeks, before doing whatever he had done. Dawson was leaning against the wall of the cabin, his breathing heavy. He muttered that this meant it wasn't just Catherine and Anne Morrison. There were others, many others. How many women had disappeared over the years in different parts of Massachusetts, their cases filed as runaways or accidents, when in fact they were all victims of the same person. The magnitude of the horror was beginning to reveal itself, and it was far greater than anyone could have imagined. Porter knew they needed to document everything carefully. Every object in that hut was potential evidence, a piece of the puzzle that could help identify not only the perpetrator, but also all of his victims. But as he examined more items, a terrifying question began to form in his mind. If that cabin had been abandoned for so long, if the diary had entries from years ago, where was the person responsible now? And more importantly, had he stopped, or had he simply moved to another location? Porter and Dawson spent the rest of that day documenting everything they found in the cabin. They used paper and pencil to make detailed notes, drew a rudimentary map of the area, and cataloged each item as best they could. The work was slow and painstaking, but both knew that any mistake or omission could mean missing a crucial clue. When the sun finally began to set, tinting the sky orange, the hues barely penetrating the forest's density, they decided it was time to return to town. The ride back was made in silence. Both were absorbed in their own thoughts, processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. Porter carried the diary and some of the most important objects, neatly wrapped in his bag. He knew those items needed to be preserved and studied more calmly. Every page of the diary, every belonging found, could contain vital information about the victims and potentially who was responsible for those horrific crimes. That night at the Berkshire police station, the 2 men worked late into the night by the dim light of oil lamps. Porter began to read the diary systematically, starting with the first entries dating from 1915. The handwriting in the opening pages was more organized, almost elegant, suggesting the author still retained some control over his impulses. The first entries were seemingly innocent observations about life in the Massachusetts countryside, descriptions of nature, comments on the weather and seasons. But as he progressed through the pages, Porter noticed a gradual change in tone. The entries began to focus more on people, especially young women. The author described in disturbing detail how they moved, how they spoke, the type of clothing they wore. There was a growing obsession that leaped off the pages, a fixation that became more intense with each entry. By mid-1916, the notes began to include specific times, routes that certain women took, information about their families, and daily routines. The first truly alarming entry was dated October 1916. The author described following a young woman referred to only as Martha to her home, watching from afar as she turned on the porch lights at dusk. He wrote about the desire to get closer, to talk to her, but also about the fear of being rejected or reported. There was a disturbing duality there, a conflict between impulses the author clearly couldn't fully control. Dawson, meanwhile, had begun to examine the objects from the chest more thoroughly. He separated the items by type, trying to find patterns or connections. Some of the belongings had embroidered or engraved initials that could help identify the victims. He carefully wrote down each initial, planning to send telegrams to other precincts in different parts of Massachusetts, inquiring about unsolved cases of missing women whose names matched those letters. Porter continued reading. In April 1917, there was an entry describing an encounter. The author had finally approached one of the women he had been observing, a young woman who worked in a fabric store in an unnamed town. He described the conversation as cordial, but brief, saying she had been polite but clearly disinterested. The rejection seemed to have triggered something in the author. The next entries were darker, angrier. He wrote about the injustice of being ignored, about how these women couldn't see beyond appearances. And then, in June of that same year, there was an entry that made Porter stop breathing for a moment. The author described having finally acted. He didn't give explicit details, but it was clear from the context that he had done something terrible. He wrote about the silence of the forest, about how it kept secrets better than any confessional, about how he felt simultaneously powerful and tormented. It was a veiled confession of a crime that had probably never been solved. Porter looked up from the journal and looked at Dawson. In a controlled voice, he asked if the sheriff remembered any cases of a woman who disappeared in Berkshire County in June 1917. Dawson thought for a moment, then went to his files. He returned a few minutes later with a thin folder. Yes, there had been a case. A young woman named Martha Henley, 22, who worked in a fabric store, had disappeared while walking home from work. Her body was never found, and the case remained unsolved. The confirmation was both validating and terrifying. It meant the diary was genuine, that these weren't the fantasies of a disturbed mind, but actual records of crimes committed. And if Martha Henley was real, then all the other mentions in the diary probably were too. Porter made a quick mental calculation based on the number of entries and their frequency. He estimated there could have been between 10 and 15 victims over the years. It was a shocking number, especially considering each case had likely been handled in isolation, with no one noticing the pattern. As Porter continued reading the diary, he began to notice something interesting. The author never mentioned his own name, but occasionally made references to his work and travels. He apparently moved around the Massachusetts countryside quite a bit, which would explain why the crimes occurred in different counties. One entry mentioned transporting goods between cities. Another talked about making deliveries to isolated farms. Porter began to suspect the person responsible might be a traveling merchant or someone whose profession required constant travel. The last diary entries were the most disturbing. Dating from early 1922, they showed a man losing even more control. The writing was more erratic, the sentences more fragmented. He wrote about voices he heard, about dreams, where the women he had hurt came back to haunt him. There were mentions of wanting to stop, of wishing to be someone different, but also the admission that the impulses were too strong to resist. The last entry was from July 1922, just 3 months before the Blackwood sisters disappeared. In this final entry, the author wrote about being tired of using the cabin in the Berkshire woods. He mentioned the place was becoming risky, that he had seen hunters too close on several occasions. He talked about needing to find a new place, perhaps farther east, in a region he described as quieter and less guarded. Porter felt his stomach tighten. Farther east meant towards Northampton, towards the area where the Blackwood sisters had disappeared. Dawson was pale when Porter shared this information. They now had a clear timeline. The person responsible had operated in western Massachusetts for years, using the cabin as a kind of hideout or place to store his macabre trophies. When he felt the area was becoming dangerous, he moved east, and there committed the crime against the Blackwood sisters. The question was, where was he now? Had he moved again? Was he planning his next attack? The two sheriffs worked through the night, compiling all the information into a comprehensive report. They knew they needed to act fast, that every day of delay could mean another life in danger. For the first time in months, Porter felt he was truly close to solving the case, but that closeness brought with it the crushing weight of responsibility and the urgency of finding the person responsible before it was too late. At dawn, Porter and Dawson sent urgent telegrams to every precinct in eastern Massachusetts, warning of the possible presence of a dangerous criminal in the region. They included the physical description compiled from the various witness accounts. A tall male between 30 and 40 years old, dark hair, a tendency to wear discreet clothing, and a hat that concealed his face, possibly working as a street vendor or in some profession that required constant travel between cities. The message ended with a request that any missing woman case, no matter how recent or old, be reported immediately. The answers began to arrive over the next day. They were more numerous than Porter had expected, and each telegram brought with it a story of sadness and unsolved mystery. A young woman who disappeared in Springfield in 1918 while returning from visiting an aunt. 2 sisters who vanished in Worcester in the summer of 1920. A teacher who never made it to school on a fall morning in 1916 in a town near Boston. Each case had been investigated locally, but with no connection between them, the authorities never realized they were dealing with something much larger. Porter spent hours organizing the information on a large map of Massachusetts that Dawson had pinned to the wall of the police station. He marked each case with a pin, using different colors for different years. The pattern that emerged was shocking. The crimes began in the far west of the state in 1915 and gradually moved eastward over the years, like a dark wave sweeping through the Massachusetts countryside. It was possible to trace an almost linear route, suggesting that the person responsible, in fact, moved constantly, never staying too long in the same area. What caught Porter's special attention was a detail that appeared in several of the reports. Witnesses in different cities mentioned seeing a street vendor who regularly passed through the area, a man who sold various products from household items to home remedies. He traveled in a horse-drawn cart, rarely stayed more than a few days in each place, and was described as polite but reserved. Few remembered his name, and those who did gave different names, suggesting he used false identities. Dawson began making calls to merchants and shop owners in various cities, asking if they knew or had ever done business with street vendors who fit the description. The information he collected was useful, but frustrating. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of street vendors roaming the Massachusetts countryside at that time. It was a common profession for men who had no land of their own or who preferred the freedom of the road. Identifying a specific one among so many seemed an impossible task. It was then that Porter had an idea. He went back to the journal and started looking for specific details that might differentiate this salesman from others. In an entry from 1919, the author mentioned having acquired a new wagon after the old one had broken down beyond repair. He described the new wagon proudly, mentioning that it had a left front wheel that produced a distinctive creak due to an axle problem he had never fully fixed. It was a small, but potentially identifiable detail. Porter sent another telegram to the police stations, this time asking specifically about street vendors whose wagon had a creaking wheel. The response he received 2 days later, coming from a small town called Amherst, about 15 miles north of Northampton, made his heart race. The local sheriff reported that yes, there was a vendor who passed through town occasionally, and several residents had commented on the distinctive sound of his wagon. The man had last been seen there 3 weeks ago in mid-January. Amherst was dangerously close to where the Blackwood sisters had disappeared. Porter felt a mixture of excitement and terror. They were on the right track, but it was also clear that the person responsible was still in the area, possibly planning or having already committed another crime. Porter decided it was time to return to Northampton. He thanked Dawson for all the help and promised to keep him informed of any developments. The 2 men said goodbye with a firm handshake, united by the dark knowledge they now shared. The trip back to Northampton took 2 days. Porter used the time on the train to review all his notes, mentally organizing the next steps in the investigation. When he finally arrived in his city at the end of a freezing February afternoon, he went straight to the police station. His deputies were anxious for news, and when Porter began to tell what he had discovered, the silence that settled in the room was as thick as fog. Porter arranged a meeting with the leading merchants and business owners of Northampton and the surrounding towns. He wanted to know about all the street vendors who had passed through the region in recent months. The meeting took place at the City Hall, and more than 20 people attended. When Porter described the man he was looking for and mentioned the detail of the wagon with the creaking wheel, 3 people immediately raised their hands. One of the merchants, a grocery store owner, clearly remembered a salesman who fit the description. The man had entered her shop in October of 1922, a few days before the Blackwood sisters disappeared, wanting to buy provisions. The merchant remembered him because the seller had paid with old coins, some of them so worn it was barely possible to see the markings. She also remembered the sound of the wagon as the man drove away, a high-pitched creak that echoed through the street. Another merchant, the owner of a blacksmith shop, had even more valuable information. The same salesman had shown up at his shop a few days later, asking if he could repair the wagon's axle. The blacksmith had examined the problem and explained that it would be necessary to replace the entire piece, an expensive and time-consuming job. The salesman had thanked him and left without repairing it, saying that he might come back another day. The blacksmith noticed that the man looked nervous, constantly looking to the sides as if expecting to be followed. The third person with information was a widow who ran a small inn on the outskirts of Northampton. She remembered that a man matching the description had stayed in one of her rooms for 3 nights in October. He registered under the name Thomas Whitmore, paid in advance, and rarely left his room during the day, preferring to leave only after dark. She thought it was strange, but she didn't question it, because he was polite and paid on time. When she asked what he sold, he vaguely replied that they were assorted products, but she never saw any merchandise. Porter felt that the pieces were finally falling into place. He asked the widow if he could examine the room where the man had stayed, even though he knew it had been used by other guests since then. She agreed, and Porter went there, accompanied by 2 deputies. The room was simple, with a bed, a chest of drawers, and a chair next to the window that overlooked the road. Porter scanned every inch, looking for anything that might have been left behind. It was under the bed that he found something, a small piece of paper, so thin and inconspicuous it had easily gone unnoticed during cleaning. Porter picked it up carefully and held it to the window light. It was a receipt from a shop in a town called Hadley, about 10 miles north of Northampton, dated November of 1922, a month after the Blackwood sisters disappeared. The receipt was for the purchase of ropes, canvas, and various tools. The discovery was disturbing. Why would someone buy these specific items a month after committing a crime? Porter had a terrible thought. What if the person responsible was still holding the Blackwood sisters somewhere? What if, unlike the other victims whose bodies were never found, this time he had kept the victims imprisoned? The possibility was terrifying, but it also offered a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, Eleanor and Margaret were still alive. Porter left for Hadley the next morning, taking with him 3 armed deputies. The town was even smaller than Northampton, with just over 1,000 inhabitants, mostly farmers and their families. The store mentioned on the receipt was on Main Street, a modest establishment that sold everything from farm tools to textiles and groceries. The owner was a white-haired gentleman named Edgar Finch, who had been running the business for over 30 years. When Porter showed the receipt, Finch adjusted his glasses and examined the paper carefully. Yes, he remembered that sale. It wasn't every day that someone bought that particular combination of items. The customer was a tall, simply dressed man who spoke little throughout the transaction. Finch especially remembered the man's eyes, which were an almost ghostly pale blue, and the way he avoided direct eye contact, always looking slightly to the side when he talked. Porter asked if Finch had any idea where the man went after leaving the store. The merchant thought for a moment, then said yes. He had watched the guy climb into a wagon and follow the road that led north towards the more rural and isolated areas of the county. Finch commented that he clearly heard the creaking of one of the wagon's wheels, a sound so high-pitched it caused some dogs in the neighborhood to start barking. It was exactly the confirmation Porter needed. The road north of Hadley ran through farmland before entering a region of dense forests dotted with isolated estates. Porter and his men rode slowly, stopping at each farm along the way to ask if anyone had seen the traveling salesman or his distinctive wagon. Most farmers were cooperative, eager to help, but few had useful information. Street vendors passed by occasionally, but most people didn't pay much attention unless they were interested in buying something. It was on a particularly secluded property, almost on the edge of the forest, that Porter finally got a solid lead. The farm belonged to an elderly couple, the Sullivans, who had lived there for more than 40 years. Mrs. Sullivan, a petite woman with keen eyes, perfectly remembered a salesman who had appeared in November. She remembered him because he had asked permission to camp on their land for a few nights, claiming that his wagon needed repairs and he had no money for an inn. The Sullivans, being kind-hearted people, had agreed, allowing him to set up a rudimentary camp next to an abandoned barn at the back of the property. The man stayed there for almost a week, leaving during the day and returning only at dusk. Mrs. Sullivan found his behavior strange, but her husband argued that many men who lived on the road were simply reserved by nature. When the vendor finally left, he thanked them profusely and left some household items as payment for the hospitality. Porter asked to see the spot where the man had camped. The Sullivans guided him to the back of the property, where a barn of gray weathered wood stood alone among sparse trees. The camp had been set up next to the structure, sheltered from the wind, but still visible from the main house. Porter began to examine the area meticulously. Snow had covered most of the remains, but it was still possible to see marks where a fire had been made, and depressions in the ground where tent stakes had probably been driven. One of his deputies called out to Porter, pointing to something near the base of the barn. There were footprints in the partially melted and refrozen snow, forming a pattern that suggested someone had repeatedly walked between the camp and the barn. Porter approached the old structure. The door was held by a rusty chain, but the padlock that was supposed to lock it was broken, hanging uselessly. He pushed the door open, which opened with a groan of old wood and rusty hinges. The inside of the barn was dark and smelled of mold and rotting wood. Rays of light entered through cracks in the walls and ceiling, creating irregular patterns on the floor, covered with old straw and debris. Porter turned on his flashlight and began scouring the space. There were remnants of old farm equipment scattered everywhere, broken tools, pieces of rotting wood. At the back of the barn, partially hidden behind a pile of old hay, he saw something that made his heart race. It was a hatch on the floor, barely visible under the accumulated dirt. Porter quickly cleared the surrounding area and pulled the heavy wooden door, which opened, revealing a rustic staircase descending into the darkness. The air rising from the basement was cold and carried an unpleasant odor. Porter looked at his deputies, all now with their guns drawn, and then began to descend slowly, illuminating the way with his flashlight. The basement was small, built with stone walls that dripped with moisture. There were recent marks of disturbance on the dirt floor, areas where clearly someone had dug and then covered again. Porter felt nausea rising in his throat. He began to examine these areas more closely, looking for any sign of what might be buried there. It was when his flashlight illuminated a specific corner that he saw something that made him stop completely. There were chains attached to the stone wall, chains strong enough to bind a person. The metal still looked relatively new, not completely consumed by rust as one would expect in an old abandoned basement. Next to the chains on the dirt floor were dark spots that could be anything, but that Porter feared were blood. And then, partially buried in the loose earth next to the wall, he saw a piece of light blue cloth. With trembling hands, Porter tugged at the fabric carefully. It was part of a dress, torn and dirty, but still recognizable. He called his deputies down and ordered them to begin digging carefully in that area. Each shovel of earth removed increased his apprehension. They dug for almost an hour, finding more pieces of fabric, a woman's shoe, a broken hair comb. But they found no bodies, which was both a relief and a frustration. Porter climbed up from the basement and back to where the Sullivans were eagerly waiting. He asked if they had seen the seller entering the barn during his stay on the property. Mr. Sullivan said yes, a few times, but he had always thought the man was just seeking shelter from the rain or exploring the structure out of curiosity. They never imagined that something sinister was happening there a few meters from their own home. The discovery of the basement changed everything. There was now physical evidence that the person responsible had held victims, at least temporarily. The pieces of cloth and other items found would be compared with descriptions of what the Blackwood sisters were wearing on the day of their disappearance. If there was a match, it would mean that Eleanor and Margaret had been there. But where were they now? Still alive somewhere else? Or did their bodies lie in some unknown grave in the vast Massachusetts forest? Porter knew he was closer than ever to catching the person responsible. The man had left traces, had become careless, or perhaps too arrogant. But it was also clear that he was mobile, always one step ahead, changing locations before the authorities could catch up with him. The question that plagued Porter as he and his men searched the abandoned barn was simple, but terrifying. Where was the criminal at this very moment, and how many other women were in danger? The following days were a frantic race against time. Porter organized the largest joint investigative effort Massachusetts had ever seen. Sheriffs from 15 different counties shared information. Telegrams crisscrossed the state at all times, and posters with the suspect's description were distributed in every town, village, and staging post along the major roads. The description was detailed. A tall male between 35 and 45 years old, possibly with gray hair at the temples, light blue eyes, wearing simple, understated clothing, traveling in a wagon with a defective left front wheel, possibly using the name Thomas Whitmore or other aliases. The Blackwood family was informed of the findings. Porter personally visited the property, sitting once more in the room where so many difficult conversations had already taken place. He explained to Mr. Blackwood and Thomas about the cellar found, about the evidence that suggested Eleanor and Margaret had been there. He was careful in choosing his words, not wanting to completely destroy hope, but also being honest about the gravity of the situation. The old merchant wept openly, his hands trembling as he held his son. Thomas, now 17 and looking much older due to suffering, swore that he would help in any way possible. The pieces of cloth found in the basement were taken to the Blackwood home. The family's housekeeper, a lady who knew every item of the girl's wardrobe, examined the fragments carefully. Her hands trembled as she confirmed that, yes, the light blue fabric exactly matched the dress Eleanor wore on the day of the disappearance. It was a piece that the housekeeper herself had helped sew months earlier, and she recognized the specific pattern of the flowers embroidered on the hem. The confirmation brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the room, but it also renewed Porter's resolve. Meanwhile, the responses to the distributed posters began to arrive. There were reports of sightings in at least 7 different cities scattered across central and eastern Massachusetts. Some were clearly false alarms, people mistaking innocent travelers for the wanted suspect. But 3 accounts seemed genuine and followed a geographical pattern that suggested steady movement toward the coast. The most recent was from a town called Concord, about 50 miles east of Northampton, where an innkeeper reported hosting a man matching the description just 5 days ago. Porter immediately set out for Concord, taking with him 4 well-armed deputies. The journey was made partly by train and partly on horseback, traversing the still frozen landscape of Massachusetts as February slowly gave way to March. Concord was a historic city, known for its role in the American Revolution, with well-kept streets and buildings that breathed tradition. The innkeeper, a young man named Patrick O'Brien, was visibly nervous when Porter arrived. O'Brien explained that the guest in question had stayed only 2 nights, paying in advance and remaining isolated in his room. What caught the innkeeper's attention was the fact that the man insisted on parking his wagon at the back of the property, away from the main street, claiming he did not want to disturb the movement of the other guests. O'Brien also noted that the subject rarely ate in the common hall, preferring that food be brought to the room. When he finally left, it was before dawn, and O'Brien didn't notice his absence until hours later. Porter asked to examine the room where the man had stayed. It was a modest space on the 2nd floor, with a simple bed, a small table, and a window that looked out to the back of the property. He scoured every inch meticulously, examining under the bed, inside the closet, behind the furniture. It was in the back of a desk drawer that he found something intriguing: writing marks transferred to the wood, as if someone had pressed hard with a pen when writing on paper resting on that surface. Porter took a pencil and paper, using a simple technique of lightly dabbing the graphite over the surface to reveal the imprint. Words and fragments of sentences began to appear. He was able to distinguish what appeared to be part of an address, something ending in Moore Street, then Salem, and what could be warehouse near the dock. It wasn't much, but it was something. Salem was on the coast about 40 miles north of Boston, a port city known for its history of witchcraft trials and for its old warehouses along the harbor. The discovery made sense within the pattern of motion Porter had identified. The criminal was constantly moving east, and Salem would represent a strategic point. It was a city big enough for someone to get lost in the crowd, but with secluded areas along the pier where one could find abandoned or unfrequented structures. Porter felt a mixture of excitement and urgency. If the man was in Salem, they needed to get there quickly before he disappeared again, or even worse, before he claimed another victim. The trip to Salem took a whole day. Porter and his men arrived in town at dusk, when the lights of the gas lamps began to be lit along the streets, and the salty smell of the Atlantic Ocean filled the air. Salem was bustling even at that hour, with dock workers ending their shifts, fishermen returning with the day's catch, and merchants closing their shops. Porter went directly to the local police station, where he introduced himself to the chief of police, a burly veteran named Samuel Ackerman. Ackerman had already received telegrams about the case and was prepared to help. He knew Salem like the back of his hand, having patrolled its streets for more than 20 years. When Porter mentioned the clue about a warehouse near the wharf, Ackerman frowned thoughtfully. There were dozens of warehouses along the port, many of them old and partially abandoned, especially in the southern area where trade had declined in recent decades. It would be necessary to check them systematically, a task that would take time and personnel. Ackerman mobilized 8 of his best men, and together with Porter and his deputies, formed 3 search parties. The plan was to start at dawn, checking every warehouse, every abandoned structure, every place where someone could hide or keep victims imprisoned. Porter insisted that they be cautious but quick, as every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death for Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood, if they were still alive. That night, Porter could barely sleep in the small boarding house where he stayed. His mind worked incessantly, going over every detail of the case, every clue, every connection. He thought of the families destroyed by the monster they hunted, the lives interrupted, the futures stolen. He thought of all the women whose names he now knew through the diary and the accounts: Martha Henley, Catherine and Anne Morrison, Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood, and so many others whose cases had not yet been completely connected. Each of them had been somebody, had loved and been loved, had dreams and hopes, and they had all had their lives torn away because of the unhealthy impulses of a single man. When the sun finally began to rise over the Atlantic Ocean, painting the sky pinkish and golden, Porter was already awake and prepared. He found Ackerman and the other men at the police station, all armed and determined. They divided a map of Salem into sections, each group responsible for a specific area of the warehouses along the wharf. Porter took the southern section, the oldest and most degraded area, where he instinctively felt he would find what he was looking for. The first few hours of searching were frustrating. Warehouse after warehouse revealed only dust, abandoned equipment, and rats. Some were locked, demanding they break down the doors. Others had homeless people who had found shelter there and were frightened by the arrival of the police. Porter was beginning to feel despair growing when, nearby, one of his deputies shouted from inside a particularly secluded warehouse at the end of a secondary pier. Porter rushed there, his heart pounding. The deputy was standing next to a pile of old boxes, pointing to the ground. There, half hidden under the debris, was a wagon wheel with clear signs of axle damage. Next to it, partially covered by canvas, were supplies, ropes, chains, and a collection of women's personal effects that included combs, scarves, and even a small hand mirror. Porter felt his blood run cold. They had found the criminal's hiding place. The question now was, where was he? And more importantly, where were his victims? The warehouse where the wagon wheel was found was a 3-story structure built of wood, darkened by time and the sea air. Broken windows stared out to sea like empty eyes, and the smell of salt mixed with mold was almost suffocating. Porter ordered his men to surround the building completely before entering, ensuring no one could escape without being seen. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against pier pillars and the occasional cries of seagulls flying over the harbor. With guns drawn, Porter and 3 deputies cautiously entered through the main gate of the warehouse. The interior was a maze of narrow corridors among piles of old boxes, abandoned nautical equipment, and coiled ropes that hung from the ceiling like petrified serpents. The light coming in through the broken windows created irregular patterns on the dust-covered floor, and each step produced creaks in the old wood that echoed through the empty structure. Porter felt every muscle tense, every sense sharpened, prepared for any sudden movement. They searched the ground floor systematically, checking every corner, every space where anyone could hide. They found more evidence of someone's recent presence. Food scraps that hadn't yet completely rotted, cold ashes from a makeshift campfire inside a metal barrel, a shabby blanket folded up next to a window. But there was no sign of the criminal or any victim. Porter motioned for them to go up to the second floor, using a wooden ladder that groaned dangerously under the weight of the men. The second floor was even more desolate than the ground floor. There was less light, and the air was heavier, laden with an odor that Porter couldn't fully identify, but that made his stomach churn. Small rooms opened from a central corridor, each containing only debris and garbage accumulated over decades. It was in the third room that one of the deputies found something that made everyone stop. There were recent drag marks on the dusty floor, as if something heavy had been moved repeatedly between that room and the end of the hallway. Following the marks, they came to a reinforced wooden door different from the others on the floor. This door had new hinges and a sturdy padlock locking it from the outside. Porter felt his heart race. He ordered one of the deputies to break the lock with a shot. The sound of the gun echoed through the entire warehouse, frightening in the stillness. The lock broke, and Porter pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight illuminating the interior. What he saw made the air flee from his lungs. The room was small, windowless, and completely empty, except for chains attached to the wall and floor. There were dark spots scattered across the wood, some clearly old blood already dried. Pieces of torn fabric were scattered around the corners. But most disturbing were the marks on the walls, deep scratches on the wood, as if someone had tried desperately to escape, nails breaking against the hard surface, and there were words carved precariously on one of the walls, probably made with a fingernail or some sharp object. "Help us." And below, almost illegible, "Eleanor and Margaret." Porter had to lean against the wall for a moment, emotion almost overpowering him. Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood had been there in that horrible place, chained and terrified. But where were they now? The chains were empty, the padlocks open. Someone had moved them recently, perhaps when the criminal noticed the police were approaching. Or had something worse happened? Porter didn't want to think about the darker possibilities. A shout from the upper floor sent everyone running. One of the deputies who had gone up to check the third floor was calling urgently. Porter climbed the stairs as fast as he could, almost stumbling in his haste. The third floor was primarily a large open space, probably used in the past to store larger loads, and there in the far corner, illuminated only by the faint light coming in through a broken skylight in the ceiling, was a human figure. It was a man sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. For a moment, Porter thought he might be the criminal they were looking for, but when he got closer, he realized it was someone different. The subject was dressed in torn and dirty clothes, had visible injuries on his face and arms, and appeared in a state of shock. When he saw Porter and the other officers, he began to speak rapidly, almost incoherently, his voice hoarse, as if he had screamed until he lost his strength. The man identified himself as Jonathan Watts, a Salem dock worker. He told a terrifying story. 3 days ago, while searching for tools he had lost near the abandoned warehouses, he heard strange sounds coming from that structure. Curious and worried, he went in to investigate. That's when he found the criminal on the second floor, along with 2 women chained in that locked room. When the criminal saw him, he violently attacked him, beating him, and then locking him there on the third floor, threatening to kill him if he made any noise. Jonathan said the criminal returned several times in the following days, always bringing scarce food and water, but mostly to check if he was still there. The guy seemed more and more agitated, talking to himself, saying that he needed to get rid of everything, that the police were too close. The night before, he had gone upstairs for the last time, telling Jonathan that he was leaving and that no one would find him there until he starved to death. But Jonathan finally managed to break the old door to the room where he had been locked only hours ago, even though he was too weak to go down the stairs. Porter urgently asked about the 2 women. Jonathan, with tears in his eyes, said that the criminal took them away on the morning of that same day. He heard them crying as they were dragged down the stairs. The guy shouted something about the forest, about finishing what he started, about finally having peace. Jonathan didn't see where they went exactly because he was still locked, but he heard the sound of the wagon leaving outside the warehouse, that distinctive creak of the faulty wheel moving away toward the inner city. Porter felt panic and determination in equal measure. The criminal had Eleanor and Margaret, and was taking them somewhere in the woods. That could mean any of the vast forested areas around Salem, or maybe he was returning to one of the previous locations he had already used. Porter ordered 2 deputies to stay with Jonathan, providing immediate medical care, while he and the others ran after the criminal. Every minute was precious now. They ran down from the warehouse and went straight to where Ackerman was coordinating the search. Porter quickly explained the situation. Ackerman immediately mobilized all available men and organized pursuit parties. He suggested they first check the roads leading from Salem to the forested areas to the west, as a wagon with a faulty wheel would leave audible trails and be remembered by anyone who came across it. Messengers were sent in all directions, warning farmers and residents of rural areas to be on the lookout, It was a young courier who returned less than an hour later with crucial information. A farmer living on the western outskirts of Salem had seen a creaking wheel wagon pass by his property about 3 hours ago, following the old road that led into the Danvers forests. The farmer thought it was strange because that road was little used, leading only to a few abandoned properties and a dense forested area that most people avoided. Porter felt he was close. They mounted their horses and set off immediately, following the direction indicated by the farmer. The old road was exactly as described, narrow, full of potholes, and flanked by trees that curved over it like twisted fingers. As they advanced, Porter began to hear that unmistakable sound in the distance, the high-pitched, rhythmic creak of a faulty wheel. They were on the right track. He motioned for the men to slow down and proceed more cautiously. The element of surprise could be crucial, especially considering the criminal was armed and, more importantly, had hostages. Through the trees, Porter finally saw the wagon stopped in a clearing ahead. The horse that pulled it was loose, grazing peacefully, and there was no immediate sign of the criminal or the Blackwood sisters. Porter and his men quietly dismounted and approached on foot, using the trees as cover. As they got closer, they could hear voices. One of them was male, speaking in a low but agitated tone. The other two were female, and even from afar, it was possible to perceive the terror in them. Porter motioned for his men to surround the clearing from different directions. He himself advanced carefully until he could see through the bushes. The scene he witnessed would be part of his nightmares for the rest of his life. The criminal was there, finally visible, a tall man with partially gray dark hair wearing shabby clothes. And beside him, bound and gagged, were two young women who could only be Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood, still alive after all those months of torment. Porter felt every muscle in his body tense as he watched the scene in front of him. Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood were visibly shaken, their dresses torn and dirty, their hair disheveled, their faces scarred by the suffering of months in captivity. But they were alive, and this realization filled Porter with an iron determination. He would not allow that monster to hurt them again. He made silent signals to his men, coordinating a simultaneous approach from multiple directions. The plan was simple: completely surround the criminal before revealing their presence, eliminating any chance of escape, or that he would use the sisters as a shield. The man kept talking, his voice oscillating between frantic whispers and moments of suppressed screaming. He seemed to be in some kind of internal debate, gesturing to the sky and then to the surrounding trees, as if talking to unseen presences. He said disconnected things about voices that wouldn't leave him alone, about how everything would have been different if people had paid attention to him, about how women were all the same, looking through him as if he were transparent. It was the delirium of a completely fragmented mind, someone who had lost any connection with reality long ago. Porter waited until all of his men were in position. Then, taking a deep breath, he came out from behind the trees with his revolver in hand, pointed directly at the criminal. His voice cut through the air of the clearing like a whip as he identified himself as a sheriff and ordered the man to move away from the sisters and place his hands where they could be seen. The other deputies emerged simultaneously from different points, forming a complete circle around the clearing. There was no possible escape route. The criminal froze for a moment, his pale blue eyes wide in surprise, and then in what seemed to be relief mixed with despair. He looked at Porter, then at the guns pointed in his direction, and finally at Eleanor and Margaret. For a terrible instant, Porter thought he might try something desperate, but then the man's shoulders fell in defeat. He raised his hand slowly, moving away from the sisters without resistance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was surprisingly calm, almost resigned. He said only that he knew this day would come eventually, that he could no longer run away from the voices or the memories. 2 deputies rushed forward, handcuffing the criminal, while others rushed to free Eleanor and Margaret. The ropes that bound the sisters were cut, the gags carefully removed. Both were too weak to stand on their own, and the men had to support them. Eleanor, the eldest, managed to murmur a thank you interspersed with sobs, while Margaret simply wept, her body trembling uncontrollably. Porter approached them, taking off his own coat to cover Eleanor's shoulders, while another deputy did the same for Margaret. Porter then turned to the prisoner, who was kneeling on the ground, with his hands cuffed behind his back. He asked his real name, and the man hesitated before answering. His name was Ezekiel Thorne, a native of a small town in western Massachusetts, the son of a Protestant minister who had died when he was 12. His mother had remarried a violent man who beat him regularly, and he had run away from home at the age of 15. Since then, he had lived on the road, working when he could, but always feeling invisible, ignored, despised by everyone. Women especially, he said, always looked through him as if he didn't exist. Porter had no interest in listening to justifications or stories of self-pity. He interrupted Ezekiel, saying that there would be enough time for confessions in prison, where he would spend the rest of his days or be hanged for the crimes he committed. He ordered the deputies to take him back to Salem immediately, while he himself would see to it that Eleanor and Margaret received urgent medical attention. The prisoner was lifted up and dragged toward the horses, his steps faltering, his head bowed. The hunt that had consumed months was finally over. Eleanor and Margaret were carefully led to the wagon, which ironically would be used to transport them back to civilization. Porter rode alongside them all the way back, talking softly, reassuring them that they were safe now, that it was all over. The sisters recounted fragments of the nightmare they lived. They were captured that October afternoon, dragged into the forest by Ezekiel, who was waiting for them, hidden on the trail. He kept them in different locations over the months, always moving them when he felt he was being chased. The time in captivity had been an endless torture of hunger, cold, fear, and the constant uncertainty about whether they would live to see another day. By the time they finally reached Salem, a crowd had already gathered in front of the police station. News of the capture had spread quickly. Ackerman had arranged for a doctor who examined the sisters immediately, treating their physical injuries while trying to assess the psychological trauma they would carry for the rest of their lives. Telegrams were immediately sent to Northampton, informing Mr. Blackwood and Thomas that Eleanor and Margaret had been found alive. The answer came hours later, a simple telegram written with trembling hands. "Leaving now. God bless you." Ezekiel Thorne was locked in the most secure cell at the Salem police station under constant surveillance. Over the next few days, he confessed to 17 murders over 7 years, each described in disturbing detail that confirmed Porter's worst suspicions. He revealed the location of some of the victims buried in different parts of the Massachusetts forests, allowing families to finally have answers and be able to give proper burial to their missing daughters, sisters, and wives. The trial, when it took place 3 months later, lasted only 2 days. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Ezekiel Thorne was sentenced to death by hanging, the sentence carried out on a gray July morning in 1923. Porter was present as a witness, feeling the weight of all the cases, all the victims, all the families destroyed. When the trap opened and the rope did its terrible work, he felt no joy or satisfaction, but only a grim relief that that chapter was finally closed. None of the victims' families attended the execution. They had suffered enough and didn't need to carry that final image. Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood returned home to Northampton, where they were greeted with tears of joy and subdued celebrations. The time of captivity had changed them profoundly. Eleanor, once expansive and confident, became quiet and introspective, needing months before she was able to leave the house without feeling panic. Margaret had nightmares for years, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. But they were alive, surrounded by the love of their family, and slowly began the long process of rebuilding their lives. Years later, they would both marry and have children, bearing invisible scars, but having survived against all odds. The case became known as one of the most disturbing in Massachusetts history, leading to significant changes in the way different law enforcement jurisdictions shared information about crimes. Porter received recognition for his relentless investigation, but he always deflected the praise, saying that he just did his job, and that his only regret was not finding the pattern sooner, perhaps saving some of the other victims. He would continue as a sheriff for another 15 years before retiring, but the Blackwood case would remain the most significant of his career, the one that would define him forever. The forests of Massachusetts remain there to this day, silent and ancient, holding secrets from a darker time. Salem's abandoned warehouses were eventually demolished, replaced by new developments. The cabin in Berkshire rotted completely and disappeared under the vegetation. But the stories remain, passed down through generations. They remind us that even in the quietest communities, in the most beautiful places, darkness can lurk, waiting for its opportunity. And also reminders that the persistence, courage, and determination of people like Sheriff William Porter can bring light even in the most desperate situations. If you've made it this far on this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history, leave your comment telling us what you think of this true story that shook Massachusetts more than a century ago. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other dark and mysterious stories that have marked different times and places in the United States. Activate the notification bell to be notified whenever we publish a new case. And if you know someone who appreciates investigative stories and historical true crime, share this video.